Oh. There we go.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School again. This is the Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, Book 1, Chapter 1, Paragraph 1, and beginning with Sentence 1. 1536, written for the King of the French as a little introduction to Christian thought. Our wisdom, in so far as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of these two precedes and gives birth to the other. For in the first place, no man can survey himself without forthwith turning his thoughts toward the God in whom he lives and moves, because it is perfectly obvious that the endowments which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves, nay, that our very being is nothing else than subsistence in God alone. In the second place, those blessings which unceasingly distill to us from heaven are like streams conducting us to the fountain. Here again, the infinitive of good, which resides in God, becomes more apparent from our poverty. In particular, the miserable ruin into which the revolt of the first man has plunged us compels us to turn our eyes upward. Not only that while hungry and famishing, we may thence ask what we want, but being aroused by fear, may learn humility. Several paragraphs later, but though the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves are bound together by a mutual tie, due arrangement requires that we treat of the former, the knowledge of God, in the first place, and then descend to the knowledge of the latter. Well, we're going to take seriously Calvin's thought that our knowledge of ourselves and our knowledge of God are connected. We cannot possibly understand ourselves without bringing God into the picture, and we cannot understand God without bringing ourselves into the picture. But this time, instead of starting with God and moving toward us, we're going to start with human nature and move toward God. And we have Dr. Simona Vuletic to lead us in this discussion. May I say just for a moment before we have prayer, on Adventist Today at this time, there is an article about this topic, which suggests that Adventist beliefs in this regard are relics of the 19th century and could not possibly be relevant in the 20th, and certainly cannot be relevant in the 21st. I cannot see this matter more differently. Actually, of all the doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I think the doctrine of the state of the living and the dead is the very most important. I'd rather lose the doctrine of the second coming, the doctrine of the Sabbath, the doctrine of the sanctuary, the doctrine of the spirit of prophecy, all of them combined, rather than to lose this one. This is the most theoretically interesting, the most scientifically challenging, the most relevant to all people around the world and in all times. Everybody in California, from surfers to scientists, wants to know what happens when we die. They want to know about the mind-body problem. And so here we are. We get to learn a lot about this from Simona, Dr. Vuletic, and we will find ourselves, I think, moving from fascination with the human body to awe and respect for the master of the universe. I'm sure that's going to happen. Even if we don't try it, it's going to happen. So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, thank you again for Sabbath School. Thank you for Simona. She has contributed every week for many weeks. And now we get to turn to her and hear from her most directly and primarily. She has studied these things well and hard. Help us to learn everything we possibly can from her. I pray in Christ's name. Amen. Simona, over to you.
Thank you very much. So before I start, just a couple of notes. I don't want anybody to call me by my credentials. I ask that only in a professional setting if I don't like somebody. So please call me by my first name. Everybody is having trouble pronouncing my last name, and so I'm going to just leave it at that. Secondly, I will provide a PDF of this presentation to David so he can share it with anybody who wants. Therefore, you don't need to make notes unless you really want to, at least not about the slides themselves. And I tried to put the source for all the images that I have taken from other areas so that if you want, you can also go back and look at that. Okay, let me start with sharing my presentation first. So I titled this presentation Mind Your Gut because there is a very strong link between our gastrointestinal system, which starts with the mouth and ends with the anus, and our brain. And this link is not very well understood, and it has been a matter of research for only about 20 years or so. And I'm going to give you a very high altitude review of what that means. It's a very large topic. There are literally thousands of research papers that are published and many, many more that are coming. And it is a hot topic because it is a way how we can change things that are considered unchangeable. So I'm going to give you first a little introduction to microbiome. Micro means small, bios, life. So therefore it's a very simple term, small life. It was first used by J.J. Moore in 1952, but for a very long time, people have incorrectly saying that it was used by Dr. Lederberg. And so people who looked into the history of medicine make sure that this is correct or corrected. So the commonly understood definition is it's a community of microorganisms that live together in any given habitat. There is another term that I'm going to use occasionally. It's a holobiont. So holobiont is a term that encompasses both the host and the microorganisms that live within and on that host. So what is a microbiome? On one side, we have what we call microbiota. These are microorganisms that are considered live. So it would be bacteria, archaea, fungi, protists, algae. And then we have what we call a theater of activity. These are things that are connected in some way with the microbiota. So these are structural elements, things that these microbiota create, produce, or synthesize. There are also nucleic acids. For the reasons of biology, viruses, phages, and so on, relic DNA, they don't necessarily consider alive, but they are still part of the microbiome. So sometimes when people talk about microbiome, they consider both viruses and bacteria, archaea, fungi, and so on together. Some people talk about microbiome that talk exclusively about bacteria. So it is sometimes important to know which part of microbiome they're actually talking about. And then there is the host, that there is an interaction within the host with the microbiome. And so this entire thing we call holobiome is a universe of its own. It's so important to understand that we are just a part of that system. By the numbers, it's estimated that we have about 37 trillion cells in our body. The most conservative estimate that I could find was there are about 39 trillion microorganisms that live within and on an average human body. However, these estimates are very variable. Some sources speak of more than 100 trillion microorganisms with up to 1:100 ratio between human cells and microorganisms. And the reason for discrepancy is the ability to test certain things. There are different methods that people are using, so it's not quite easy to estimate. When you talk about the cell type, regular human body has about 200 types of human cells. There are more than 2,500 different species of bacteria that have been identified in the gut alone. And if we introduce the viruses in the gut alone, there have been potential viral species, more than 33,000 of them. So as you can see, even by variety of cells, we are in a minority here. Now, size isn't everything. So human biome weighs between 0.2 and 2 kilograms, or 0.4 to 4.4 pounds, depending on the estimate of the number, which varies, as I said, quite significantly. So a representative adult male, we say, weighs approximately 70 kilograms. So microbiome represents approximately 0.3 to 3% of our weight. So what is a gut microbiome? Bacteria represent about 90% of gut microbiota. So sometimes people, when speak about it, when they speak about gut microbiome, they actually speak interchangeably about gut bacteria. The remaining 10% are fungi, archaea, algae, protists, and so many others. There's an interesting thing that is often lost. So there are certain parasites that occasionally live in our gut. And we, at least in medicine, often look at them from a pathological point of view. However, there have been some research studies that have started, I think, probably about 30 years ago. And I see recently that they have been renewed a little bit, where certain types of parasites, when they're present in the gut, can regulate certain autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis or Crohn's disease and so on. So it seems that even what we consider pathological is not pathological in every sense of the word. If we add viruses and similar things, they are included in the microbiome, but as I said, because they're not necessarily considered alive, they are often excluded from the list of microbiota. Now, there's another term that is very often used. It's the term called metagenome. So metagenome encompasses genes from microbiota and viruses. They have specific functions. So the most clear function, obviously, is that they're going, these are sequences for synthesis of bacterial metabolites. However, they also have the ability to modulate the expression of human genes through epigenomic mechanisms. So why is this important? Generally speaking, our genetics is a given. So we have genome that is given to us through our parents. We have inherited it. The sequences are what they are. However, the ability to express genes is not a given thing. And that depends on the environment. And one of the very important elements that can modify how genes are expressed, at which time, at which levels, are microbiome or microbiota and viruses. Another thing that is also very interesting is that in human DNA, there are inserted viral sequences that have been present for a long time. And they have been considered what we call junk DNA still in some circles, but they actually most likely have regulatory functions and also affect human gene expression. And there are probably many other things that these genes can do. So looking at the comparison between number of human genes, we have about 23,000 human genes. Number of the microbiome associated genes is estimated in millions. And some of the papers that I have read exceeded 9 million genes in the gut alone. So the total number of the microbiome associated genes exceeds the number of human genes by more than 100-fold. Why does this matter? Why microbiome matters? Well, as we know, power is not defined by size. So here are some of the functions of the gut microbiome. They are primary mediators of the homeostasis of our body, which means they affect and regulate our metabolism. They create something we call barrier homeostasis. So what is that? If you look inside the gut, inside the colon and generally gastrointestinal tract, so there is a very fine biofilm that contains mucus that is created by cells that are a part of the gastrointestinal tract. And inside that are bacteria, and those bacteria that live in this biofilm they create a barrier that protects us from pathological bacteria. They also maintain tight junctions between the cells so that our guts are not leaking, the bacteria are not going somewhere they're not supposed to go to. And they're very, very important for the maintenance of good health. They are also primary mediators and regulators of the inflammation. So protection against pathogens and activation of the immune system. They regulate hematopoiesis, very important for energy production. They also biosynthesize certain things that our cells cannot, vitamin K and many of the vitamin B group. And they're also important for absorption of certain minerals. So in recent times, gut microbiome has been called a vital organ, and it is the most recently discovered organ in human body. It is a multidirectional and communicational, has connections with almost all other organs in our body. So what are the pathways of influence that microbiome has on our body? There are a neural, so this is through neurons. Humoral, which means these are certain products that they release into the circulation. Endocrine, hormones. Immunological, by regulation of immune system. And metabolic, by regulating metabolism. There are many factors that affect gut microbiome. Diet, of course, is very important. I will talk about it a little bit later. Age is important. Genetics, even though only about 10% of the composition of our microbiome is directed by genetics. Gender, men and women have slight differences. Hormone levels. Exercise is very important for the maintenance of gut microbiome. Medications. We don't know much about many of the medications that people commonly use, but we do know for some of them, of course, antibiotics have a strong effect on microbiome. Most of it not very good. Then chemicals like pesticides, flame retardants, and heavy metals as well. Our state of immunity, immunodeficiency, or hyperimmunity, like allergies, autoimmune diseases, things like that. Infections, stress, in particular chronic stress, pollution, ownership and contact with animals. Our environment, biodiversity of our environment is extremely important. And so as we reduce biodiversity, we are actually going against our own benefit. And then in children, mode of birth, breastfeeding versus formula feeding, and also social contact, all of these things affect, the microbiome in children. So I'm going to talk a little bit about microbiome. So first, couple of terms that are very common that you have probably heard. What are probiotics? Probiotics are foods or supplements that contain beneficial bacteria. So some of the examples that you probably know: yogurt, kefir, and different fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, and things like that. Prebiotics are foods that feed beneficial bacteria. And so generally they fall into two different categories. And these are fibers and phytochemicals. And all of these are found in fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, and similar things. And then symbiotics is a relatively new term. These are foods or supplements contain both probiotics and prebiotics. So it's a combination of the two. Now, there has been a lot of talk about the reason why should people eat yogurt or kefir or any of the probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, particularly probiotics. People say, well, you eat them, they go into the stomach and acid kills everything. That's not entirely true, because if you eat a few billion bacteria in yogurt or kefir or in any of the other similar foods, some of that is going to get into your gastrointestinal system below, so into ileum and further down into the colon. And then it is sufficient to basically seed the bacteria and have them reproduce and grow in numbers. Therefore, particularly if you're having some kind of treatment that requires use of antibiotics, you should consider regularly supplementing yourself with probiotics so that you don't lose the balance, which is very important. Okay, so some of the characteristics of the human gut bacteria: most gut bacteria are obligatory anaerobes, which means they don't require air, they don't want to be exposed to air, and they thrive in environment that does not have air or oxygen, more correctly. There are more than 2,500 species in the gut alone. I have actually seen some papers that claim that they have identified more than 40,000 different species of bacteria in the gut. Now, I don't know how the methods differ, so it's sometimes difficult to say. Predominant phyla are those that you see on the screen: Firmicutes, Bacteroides, Proteobacteria, Actinobacteria. They are about 90% of all bacteria in the gut. And then there are some smaller species. Initial seeding occurs immediately before, during, and following birth. And this is where it's important, for example, how a child was born, because for example, standard vaginal birth introduces children to a different set of bacteria than C-section. C-section is going to introduce them mostly to the bacteria that are present on the skin versus those that are present in the vagina. And so these are different bacteria, and they have different abilities. Gut bacteria profile matures by the age of 3, approximately. So from that time on, we have people have a mature set of gut bacteria that is characteristic to them. Now, composition can still be changed through the environment throughout your lifetime, which is a very good thing. Obviously, there are negative sides of this, but a very good thing is that it can be changed. It can be changed for the better, particularly by the diet. There are significant differences in the composition of the gut microbiome between people who are healthy and people who are ill of any age, and particularly at the older age between people who are healthy elderly and those who are frail elderly. And it seems that there is also a big difference between people who live in their homes versus people who live in facilities, and that affects their general health. An important thing is that aging reduces the complexity of bacteria in the gut. What that means? That means that as we age, the number of species that live in our gut is getting smaller and smaller, and that is not a good thing. So diversity of gut bacteria is very important for our health. And so we can maintain that diversity, we can maintain health into older age. Bacteria use food substances, so food that we eat, to produce many other molecules, including neuroactive substances, which I'm going to discuss a little bit later. And they also synthesize vitamins like vitamin K and various B-complex vitamins. When we speak about digestion, so we speak of digestion starting in the mouth, but the main focus of digestion is actually in what we keep calling gut. So what happens in the intestines, in the small intestines, the digestion that occurs in the small intestines is mostly basically metabolizing dietary elements into bioactive nutrients. I think this is sometimes lost when we talk about food and diet and digestion. Lots of people have an idea that, you know, if you eat certain food, then that food regulates more or less goes in like micromolecules, like big parts of it goes into your liver and other parts. What happens is in the intestines is that it gets degraded or metabolized into the smallest molecules that are necessary for us to absorb through the cells. So it's going to be, for example, different starches or carbohydrates. They get metabolized into simple sugars that can be then they can cross that barrier and get into circulation. There are some macromolecules that can be absorbed, for example, cholesterol, but by and large, things that we eat, they all get metabolized into the small elements, and these small elements are then transported into by blood into our system and lymph, by blood and lymph into our system, and then our cells use those metabolites to create other things like proteins and sugars, and, complex sugars, and so on. So it is important to understand that bacteria play an important role in this process. In particular, they're capable of metabolizing things that our cells cannot. So these are fibers, what we call fibers, and so there's like cellulose, oligosaccharides, and so on. So when they ingest and when they metabolize these fibers, they create certain products. And some of these products are called short-chain fatty acids. These short-chain fatty acids are among the most important signaling molecules in human body. And they are very important for the brain as well. So they may be small, but they're mighty. They produce, secrete, and respond to neuroactive compounds. And by doing so, they interact with the host. And in the process, bacteria can synthesize catecholamines, dopamine, GABA, histamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. So for those of you who know a little bit about neurology, you will recognize all these as neurotransmitters. So bacteria are capable of producing neurotransmitters. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the virome. It is often misunderstood and not often talked about. Viruses literally live everywhere. An important thing is that approximately 8% of our DNA is actually of viral origin. Most of it is what we call non-coding regions, but these regions are important for regulation of our gene expression. Some scientists estimate that there are more than 500 trillion viruses present in human body, most of them presumed non-pathological. With some exceptions, most viruses inhabit human body during and after birth. So unless the mother is infected by certain types of viruses that can go through the placenta, viruses are not present until we are born. This is a little picture of where you can find the viruses. As you can see, it's pretty much everywhere. And diversity of viruses is different depending on different human bodies. So viruses have proclivity for certain parts of certain types of cells and certain types of certain organs. Virome diversity is also regulated by microbiota, so bacteria can regulate the types of viruses that are present in our body and vice versa. Anatomical sites, so different parts of our body exposed to different things. Obviously, our mouth or our eyes don't have the same access as our gut. Our diet, our age, gender, maternal factors, and our immune status. So these things all affect the type, number, and distribution of viruses in our body. So I'm going to talk a little bit about human health and gut microbiome, and I'm going to use a couple of terms: symbiosis, eubiosis, dysbiosis, or eubiosis. So this is what microbiota throughout lifetime look like. At first, we have basically seeding of microbiome during the birth, depending on the type. Then environment, whether they were born in a hospital or they're born at home, whether there are any infections and so on. Type of food, in particular, whether a child is breastfed or using formula feeding. Then once children start using solid food, that changes depending on the amount of the fibrous diet. And then as adults, we have all these other factors that are going to help us acquire, maintain, and live with different microbiota. And then when we become older, there is certain differences between people who live healthy, who are frail, or who live in nursing homes. As I mentioned before, this infant health is very, and development is very important, is very dependent on the microbes that exist in our system. So not only that microbiome is important for things like digestion and so on, but they're important for development of immune system. They're important for development of the brain. So for example, there have been studies shown that in mice that have been bred to be sterile, so they don't have any microbes inside their gut, their blood-brain barrier, so that's the barrier that keeps the brain separate from the rest of the body and keeps it more or less sterile, becomes leaky, and that is not a good thing. Now, as I mentioned before, there is this new concept that we live with the universe of our bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms, and that if we live in a symbiotic way, then that symbiotic life is going to help us and we are helping them. So by using the correct types of food that is going to feed and support our microbiome, we are helping them to support us so that we can remain healthy. Now, dysbiosis happens when there are certain things that are not so good in life, like toxins, infections, pollution, malnutrition. These are all things that are going to lead to dysbiosis, or they affect microbiome negatively. And by that negative effect on microbiome, we suffer as well. There are also some events that can change how the microbiome works within us, but they're not necessarily bad, and they can be changed. So, for example, through development, our growth and aging, very commonly stress is going to change how the microbiome works, and so on. So all these things that exist in us that can go bad can also go well if we know how to treat our microbiome well. If we look at dysbiosis and the list of possible human diseases, as you can see, it's a very, very large list. From brain, endocrine diseases, heart diseases, lung diseases, liver diseases, pancreatic diseases, bone diseases, muscle, skin, reproductive diseases, kidney, bladder. So pretty much there isn't an organ in our body that does not require a healthy microbiome to remain healthy. This is particularly true once we become older. And so some of the age-related diseases that people often talk about, like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, muscular frailty, this was a typo somewhere, sarcopenia, osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis, colon cancer. All these diseases are very much affected by the type and function of microbiome. Now I'm going to talk a little bit, this is the last part about what we call brain-gut axis. So what is brain-gut axis? It's a bidirectional communication between the brain and gut microbiome. It's important to understand the elements. I'm not going to go into much detail, even though I'm going to mention to go through each of these a little bit. So there is something we call the ENS pathway, or enteric neuronal system, nervous system, ENS. Then vagal pathways, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis or HPA axis. These are endocrine glands. And then CNS pathways, which I'm not going to really talk much about today. This bidirectional interplay, the way how these neural components and gut microbiome work together are important for homeostasis of energy, which pretty much keeps us alive, pain sensation, insulin sensitivity, inflammatory responses, overall sense of well-being, and then mood, behavior, memory, and lots of other things. So many of the functions that we consider make us unique, and many of the functions that keep us alive depend on this interaction between our brain and microbiome. So what is the enteric nervous system, or ENS? Well, we call it the brain in your gut. It's the largest collection of neurons or neuronal cells outside of the brain. There are estimated more than 600 million neurons in the gut alone. They're embedded inside the gastrointestinal tract, and they govern its function. And what is really important, they're pretty much independent of the brain. So the function of this system is not dependent on what the brain does. There are afferent and efferent neurons, in other words, neurons that are coming and going to spinal cord and from spinal cord and brain into the gut. And this is important to send important information from the gut. So the gut is telling the brain, this is what's happening with me. And the brain is then saying, okay, so if this is happening with you, maybe you should be doing this. So this interaction is very important for the maintenance of good health of gastrointestinal system, but also for the maintenance of the brain health. Some of the neurotransmitters that are secreted by these neurons in our gut are pretty much the same neurotransmitters that are produced in your brain. So not much difference there. And if you look at the neurotransmitters that are produced by microbiome compared to neurotransmitters that are produced by enteric nervous system, you'll see that some major neurotransmitters are present in both and produced by both. And this enables microbiome to basically instruct nerves what to do and what kind of information to send to the brain. And also these neurons in the gut can instruct microbiome what to do. So it's an interplay that is very important. The politics of the ENS, of the enteric nervous system and bacterial population, is that ENS changes its physiology and gene expression based on the complexity, composition, and health of gut microbiome. So this is really important because this means that by feeding our microbiome the diet that is good for them, we can affect how well our enteric nervous system works. And by doing so, we can also change how our brain works. Now, another part, neural part of the system is the vagus. And I have quoted here J.R.R. Tolkien, who said, "Not all who wander are lost." So this is the 10th and longest cranial nerve. It's part of the autonomic nervous system or parasympathetic system. It has somatic and visceral components. In other words, it can affect organs and as well as other parts. It has sensory motoric, so it can feel things and it can instruct muscles to contract. They're mostly comprised of the afferent fibers, And then they control autonomous functions, things that we don't have to think about and that happen regardless what we are trying to do. So it's digestion, heart rate, breathing, cardiovascular activity, and reflexes. And it is also a major link between the gut and the brain. A simple translation of the word itself is the wanderer, because it starts in your brain and then pretty much wanders into every organ that we have along the way. So as you can see here, there is also effect of these afferent and efferent fibers, and it lists here what kind of function they have. So afferent fibers mostly deal with inflammation and energy, while efferent mostly deal with capacity and enzymes. And here you have a very nice representation of the interaction between enteric system and the vagus. What is really interesting, they actually do not interact directly. They interact through the microbiome. And so microbiome is basically, by and large, an intermediary between the two systems and affects both of them. And then another part that I mentioned before is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. These are major endocrine glands. So the HP axis is the main regulatory pathway for response to stress, digestion, appetite, feeling of satiety, our immune response, mood and emotions, sexuality, energy storage, and expenditure. So as you can see, these are all major metabolic areas of our body, and microbiome regulates this axis. So for example, if you have a stress stimulus, the stress stimulus causes secretion of corticotropin, trophin releasing factor by hypothalamus, which then affects secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone by pituitary, which then affects the adrenal gland to secrete cortisol or corticosterone, and that secretion and release of cortisol then effectuates stress response. And the last part that I'm going to mention here a little bit is the immune system and the gut microbiome. So gut microbiome regulates the immune system, in particular B and T cell response. This is a very important part of the maturation of our immune system and our ability to respond to our environment. So for example, germ-free mice, mice that don't have any bacteria in their gut, it has very specific abnormalities in the immune system. And what is interesting that if they are given probiotics at an early age, we can completely reverse these things. However, if we wait and we don't give them probiotics in an early age, but give them later on, then not all of these abnormalities can be reversed. That also teaches us something about our own body, that it is important what happens at an early age, because for us to maintain and develop a good, healthy immune system, that has to start very early in our childhood, from birth on. And that period is particularly important for development of the immune system and our ability to respond to environment. And there is this interesting theory, it's a hygiene theory, that because of the very widespread use of various cleaning products, the diversity of bacteria that are present in our homes has dropped, and so children are not exposed to many of them, to as many of them as they used to be, which may lead to development of many of like asthma or other immune disorders. And then another thing that is important is that gut microbiome is responsible for the proper function of the blood-brain barrier throughout a lifetime. In particular, it is important for the creation of that barrier in the beginning, so that the barrier is created in the right way, but it maintains this barrier throughout the lifetime, and is also responsible for maturation of microglia, which are immune cells inside the brain, and also affect myelination, which is the process that enables our neurons to send information and receive information very fast, which enables our brain to work as well as it does. So it is known and has been reported that there are changes in microbiome in people who have depression, anxiety, dementia, Parkinson's disease, anorexia nervosa, schizophrenia, and so on. I just read an interesting paper just a couple of days ago. For example, they compared microbiome in people who have schizophrenia versus who are, for example, have some violent tendencies versus people who have schizophrenia are non-violent, and they found huge differences in their microbiome. Now, it is difficult sometimes to say what came first, but it is an important thing that that gives hope that at some point there will be a possibility to affect this kind of negative behavior by changes in diet. And again, I'm going to just give you a brief overview. So germ-free mice that I mentioned before, they also have learning deficits. They have difficulty learning certain things. They're not as social as they normally would. So maybe there is some connection to certain types of behaviors in humans as well, like autism. They have an increased stress response and an increased anxiety. And again, if they receive treatment within a certain postnatal period where they're still young, this can be reversed. If not, some of these cannot be reversed later on. Microbiome regulates the expression of a factor that is very important for the maintenance and growth of brain cells. Neurons in the brain is called BDNF. And then microbiota also regulate the sickness behavior, which is very common. So, you know, when you get an infection or you have cancer or you have something that you just don't feel, where you have this, you know, feeling that you don't have the energy, that's what we call sickness behavior. So microbiota also regulate this behavior. There is some really interesting things that certain bacteria communicate only with specific brain regions. And so I gave you a couple of examples here with very specific strain of bacteria that regulate functions only in neurons, for example, in hippocampus, which is important for short-term memory. Or, for example, another one that implicates, has been implicated in the feeling of pain in the gut. We often think of ourselves as we are the ones who are driving things. But I would like you to consider that maybe we are talking about a little bit different concept, and I call that wagging the dog. Because the microbiome controls development, modulation, and renewal of the enteric nervous system. It produces neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters interact with these neurons in enteric nervous system, and it also affects central nervous system or our brain. They're essential for the development of the immune system. They're important for the isolation of the brain, for the periphery, and also for the maturation of the brain immune system. They can affect our emotional state, our behavior and cognition processes throughout our lifetime. So here are a couple of take-home messages. We live in a symbiotic relationship with the universe of the microbiome. We are not alone. If the cells that represent microbiome, bacteria and all these other things, were the same size of a human cell, we would be we would be much smaller than the rest of them. So just consider the numbers that I have mentioned to you. There are literally trillions of microorganisms that live in us. The interconnection between ourselves and these microorganisms is still poorly understood, but we know there is a bidirectional communication between all our organs and microbiome. Microbiome is going to affect our health, behavior, learning abilities, immunity, and many of the aspects of what we consider uniquely ours. Even genetically identical humans, like identical twins, have different microbiome, and therefore no two human beings are the same. And we bear the responsibility for good care of our microbiome. And finally, the fountain of youth may be actually in the poop. Recent experiments have shown that when they took bacteria from young mice and transplanted them into older mice, these mice suddenly became much younger in their behavior and much healthier. We are using fecal transplant. These are bacteria grown from feces of healthy people to cure some very difficult diseases. And even though it is still quite a crude tool, it is a tool that is very promising. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. I see Monty has his hand raised. Monty, would it be okay to wait till after the break, or do you need to do it now?
After the break is great.
Okay. This discussion can go in several different directions. It can go into the direction of how then should we live? What practical things can we do day by day? Should we be eating a lot of yogurt, for instance? That's one thing. Or I'd like to sometime pull this back to the discussion we had the last 2 weeks on the mind matter issue, the body and soul issue, because I was struck while looking at some of these videos that some of those philosophical discussions would be well informed by this material. So we can go philosophically, we can go practically, we can go back and forth on both of those. But Simona, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been great.
I'm open to all of these discussions.
Okay, very good. Forrest, what do you think about taking a break?
This would be a great time. We could come back at 20 minutes to 12 our time, because it's 11:30 right now. People who want to raise their hand, get your hand up so we can put you in the queue. But so I think now the time to take a break. Be back at 20 minutes to 12.
Okay, thank you, Forrest. Thank you, Simona. And thank you, everybody who's here.
Okay, David, to you.
Oh, let's see. Over to you, Forrest. I think it's.
Oh, back to me. Okay. All right. I'm going to go to Monty. Monty, you had a question. By the way, I have my hand up, but anybody else get their hand up so I can get you in the queue. All right, go ahead, Monty. You asked.
Okay, and Forrest, I have a fair number of questions, but I'm willing to do them one and then jump back in the queue behind you.
Why don't you do 2 questions?
Okay.
Because I have 2 short questions. So yeah, so do 2.
All right, and one of them's a double question. So Simona, my first question I think is foundational. So let me ask this one. This is Lisa's question, actually. How is the microbiome measured? And so is it the sort of thing that we can go get a test done and then we have these ranges that are normal, like my cholesterol range, or how does that work? How would we know if our microbiome is out of whack or not?
So yes, there is a way how to do this. Microbiome is measured by donating a stool sample, a little bit of poop, and sending it to a company that can look at the microbiome. There are two different ways how the microbiome is tested. I mean, there are many different ways, but it falls into two major categories. One is by species, so to figure out how many and which kind of different species you have. And the other is to look at the genes that are present. So they isolate the DNA, RNA, and they look at the types of genes that are present. And so both of these are possible, but I think they're done by different companies. And by looking at the diversity of bacteria that is present, you can pretty much say, okay, this is good or this is bad. There are certain bacteria that probably you don't want to have. So pathological bacteria, so that can be also found. But usually if you have that kind of bacteria, you know, because you're either having diarrhea or you're having some other problems. Generally speaking, this is the simplest way. Take a stool sample, send it to a company that can look at the microbiome. The way how it's measured, they look in terms of numbers. They look at the amount of bacteria, number of bacteria per cubic centimeter of the stool. So that is the simplest way that is being used. Now, obviously, there are some bacteria. The stool is going to contain lots of debris, so bacteria that has died. And it is difficult to ascertain the actual number of bacteria in living gut. But this is the closest approximation that we can have.
Great, thank you. So next, and this is somewhat related, so you talked about the importance of early development of the microbiome, quite early in life versus later years. So I have kind of two questions related to that. First of all is, why is that the case? What's the mechanism? Do we know what the mechanism is of why we're so receptive to the development of our microbiome early on versus later? And then what's the extent of that difference from early development of the microbiome versus later? As you know, here I am, and here all of us are, we're all beyond that early time period. And so are we a lost cause when it comes to really trying to develop a microbiome?
Well, I'm going to answer first your second question. No, we are not the lost cause, quite the opposite. And I think part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this issue is because what we eat is really important for the health of our microbiome. And it is not so important whether you're a vegetarian or a vegan, or you eat, you know, this type of food or that type of food, but to find the right type of food for the bacteria that exist in you. So not everybody is going to be the same. Some people don't feel well if they eat meat. Some people don't eat well if they don't eat meat. And so our physiology differs based on the composition of the bacteria that live in us. Therefore, you need to kind of figure out what works for you the best. There are ways how this can be done. I know, for example, there is a study where they use a continuous glucose monitor. This is a little device that gets inserted into your skin. And then they try eating different types of specific foods and see how fast their glucose level rises, right? So you don't want that glucose to rise too fast and too high. And so they're looking at, you know, what kind of food, how you respond to certain types of food. And there is this trend, hopefully that something is going to happen in the future, that every person is going to have their personalized diet that is going to be based on the bacteria that live in them, that's going to maintain the bacteria healthy and diverse. Generally speaking, as I said, you know, it's important to have lots of fibers and different fibers. So you want to have lots of different types of food that you're eating. So you don't want to get in some kind of constantly eating just one kind of thing, but you want to add different things. So you want to have different kinds of oils, different kinds of fruits, different kinds of vegetables, different kinds of nuts, different kinds of grains. All these things are important. And so the more diversity you have, the more likely it is that your bacteria is going to get what they need. As for your first question, why? So when we are born, we are pretty much tabula rasa when it comes to microbiome. But as microbes start living inside us, they, in a way, they're like a gated community. So they can tell who can live there and who can't live there. So that initial seeding, in a way, is going to limit or direct the direction of development of your microbiome. It is not something that cannot be changed, but it is something that has to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to jump back on to the end of the queue. That's very helpful. I appreciate your presentation and your answers to my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Forrest?
and I will keep you in the queue there. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you very much, Simona. I have a couple simple questions. I think they're simple. And that is, how widely spread are the studies in which you've shared with us today done throughout the world, and how highly accepted, and how much discussion is there on that? And then my second part is, what if I were to walk away with just one concept today, what would that be?
So these studies are done all over the world. Actually,
Okay.
some of the very interesting studies are coming from developing countries.
Mhm.
There are certain communities in developing countries that live a different lifestyle than we do, and their microbiome is much more diverse than ours, because the food that they eat and the environment in which they live is much less polluted and is healthier. And so where we live matters. For the most part, we don't really choose where we live, because we are tied to our jobs and all these other things. But diversity of our environment is a very important factor in diversity of the bacteria that live within us. So it's one of the things that that kind of guides research in these developing countries. But research on this issue is going on all over the world and is widely distributed. As for one concept, I would say take care of your bacteria, take care of what you eat, find out what is really the healthiest thing for you to eat. We are all different. I don't like fad diets, like vegan diets or keto diet or, whatever. I believe that every person should find a diet that works for them, that keeps them healthy, that keeps their bacteria healthy, because that's what seems to be one of the most important things. And so finding the right diet is, I think, really important. No matter what kind of diet you do choose, that diet should involve lots of fiber, lots of phytochemicals, so lots of fruit, vegetables, grains, and nuts.
Okay, thank you. Let me just add one thing. It's not a question, but in our discussion, they reminded me of a story that my father's mother told about my father when he was about 1 year old. She did everything she could to keep him clean, not get dirty. And he was getting to be quite sickly. And she took him to the doctor, and she said, "Mrs. Howe, let the kid get dirty and get some bacteria." And after that,
That's
he
true.
started feeling better. So anyway.
Yeah, my late uncle used to say that being healthy is one half of the health, being dirty is the other half.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now, Bud, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to ask it now, or do you want to pass?
Well, I was just going to suggest or state that she answered Monty's question, which was basically the information I was interested in. I guess I would ask her, she talked about a variety of foods, and that makes a lot of sense, but what's the bottom line? Why the variety of foods?
Because different kinds of food contain different types of fibers and different types of nutrients that are necessary for bacteria to thrive. So if you use only one kind, then you're going to basically you're going to have oversized population of one type of bacteria that likes that kind of fiber, which you don't want. You want to have a balance. So you want to have diverse, very different kinds of food that you eat.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I want to go to Peter. Peter, it's to you now.
Yes, I have a few comments and a few questions. The relation between the mind and the body is not something new. Already in the 6th century before Christ, the Roman writer Juvenal and satirist, he knew the relationship between the mind and the body, and he came up with a great aphorism when he said, "Mens sana in corpore sano." That means healthy mind in a healthy body, and very close relationship between the mind and the body. Of course, he didn't know too much about the right ratio, the bacteria in our bodies and neurotransmitters and many other complex things. But he knew, and it's not very hard to understand that if you have problems with your gut, you have a bad disposition and you are not very good thinking right. Another observation that I like to make is that looking at your presentation and the complexity that is in our body, I was thinking how long it took the theory of evolution to work to put all these things together and create the right relationship that creates a balance in our body. It's we have to pause and think a lot about this. Also, I was thinking that why God in the Old Testament was paying so much attention to the food that we have to eat, recommending clearly the Israelites what to eat and what not to eat. It's we can make this connection now that God knew very well that it's very important, this relationship between what we eat and basically we are what we eat. We say these days. And I have two questions, quick questions. We know that there was a lot of discussion about junk DNA. And for a while, it was believed that God put something in our body that it was not necessary because it doesn't have any role. And then later on, the scientists discovered that still this, what was called junk DNA, still have a role in our body. If you can comment a little bit about this. And the second question that I have, when you talk about the factor that affected the gut, you mentioned that ownership of animals. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this? How those that are animal owners are affected by this?
Thank you, Peter. So yes, the connection between mind and body has been known for a long time. However, obviously, our knowledge that bacteria even exists is relatively recent. It's only been a couple of 100 years. And for the most part, if you look at in history of medicine, most of the research in the beginning and for a very long time was about bacteria that harm us. So we wanted to know how these microorganisms can harm human body, how they can cause disease and which diseases they can cause, right? So it is much later concept that these bacteria actually that live within us are beneficial and that we depend on them just as much as they depend on us. And so this line of thought is really quite new, and most research has been only in the last 20 years or so. So I think it's a very interesting observation, and it is still true to this day that yes, a healthy body is required for healthy mind. Regarding your question about junk DNA, so I am not a geneticist, so I'm not an expert in this field. However, my view is that there is nothing in our body that has no purpose. This junk DNA, there are many parts of that so-called junk DNA that we know have regulatory function. In other words, there are factors that are binding to these regions, and they affect how, when, and to which extent certain genes are being expressed. In other words, if you imagine genome as an instrument, like an organ that has lots and lots and lots of keys. David, you need to mute yourself, please. David, thank you. So if you imagine genome or genes as an instrument, an organ that has, lots of levels and lots of keys. So in our case, it's more than 23,000 genes or keys. However, when you play music, you don't press each key at the same time, and you don't press each key for the same duration or with the same force. Equally, your genes are not expressed always the same way, or some genes are, for example, expressed only during development and they never, expressed again. Some are expressed only when you're sick. Some are expressed only when so they have different function. And this regulatory part, the part that tells the gene when and how and in concert with which other genes to be expressed, this is all in those regulatory regions. And this is where this junk, what people used to call junk DNA. So I believe that entire, so-called junk DNA sequence actually has a regulatory function that is helping us express our genes and play the instrument that is our genome so beautifully that makes us who we are. As far as animal ownership, generally people who live surrounded by animals are healthier. They're exposed to greater variety of microbes. There are some obviously pathogens that are also associated with that, but generally speaking, we are more dangerous for animals than they are for us from a microbiological point of view.
But how it's influencing our gut?
So environment in which we live is we have these microbiome is not only in your gut, it's also on your skin, in your eyes, in pretty much all parts of you. So some of that stuff is going to end up in your mouth, and you're going to eat some of that or inhale some of that or have it on your skin. So it changes the overall complexity of the microbiome.
Then it has some negative effects.
There are some pathogens that we can get from animals, yes, but generally speaking, it is more beneficial than dangerous.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Rod Corker now. Rodney, to you, sir.
Nice going, Simona. Thank you very much. One of the earliest propositions that was put in front of me as an Adventist, as a young Adventist, was that meat eating was permitted, given to men to shorten their human life, their longevity. Excuse my voice. However, in my own study of early civilizations, I find no evidence that any early civilization was vegetarian or vegan. In fact, if you look at the history of the people of the Garden of Eden, they love their fish and they love their meat. So that Adventist proposition that we should be vegetarians because meat eating will shorten our lives, what say you?
Well, certain types of meat are less healthy because they contain lots of saturated fats. Actually, it's just as a disclaimer, I am not an expert on microbiome. I'm just interested in that. My expertise is actually metabolism of lipids or fat. And so there is lots of misunderstanding in general public about the role of fat in life. And I would like to give you a presentation at some point to maybe help a little bit with this. But different kinds of food, I think from a purely metabolic point of view, we are not herbivores. So we require sources of protein and fat from animal sources. If we don't have these, there are certain vitamins that are present only in animal sourced food. If we don't have these, we need to supplement them. Otherwise, things are going to be disbalanced. So I'm not a proponent of diets that are very extreme in any way. I think that each person needs to find what is the right diet for them, and I'm not going to tell them one way or the other. But it is true that, for example, red meat in particular has detrimental effect on gut bacteria. They don't thrive so well, not so much because of diet that's rich in red meat, but because people who eat that kind of diet usually don't eat much vegetables or fruit. So maybe if the diet were balanced more with fruit and vegetables, it wouldn't be so bad. Again, it is very individual.
Hey, thank you. Before
thank
we go
you.
to, oh, did you have another question, Rodney? I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I think that's a very, very good answer. I would just also add support for my belief in the expression of junk DNA. It's a misnomer. It is a term that we should dispense from our vocab because science continues to find some purpose, some relationship with what was once known as junk DNA. So it's more about a mystery yet, science that will develop some purpose. So it's not a useful expression, I believe, in science.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Before I go to questioners again, there's a couple of things that have come up in the chat, Simona. I'd like to read one of them to you right now. It says, there are these probiotic supplements that supposedly restore and maintain the intestinal flora. Do you have any recommendation in relation to?
Yeah, they're certainly not going to harm. The composition is usually based on probiotics that you can find in certain fermented foods that we know are healthy. And they just provide very large quantity of them in a small volume. So particularly if you're taking antibiotics or something, it's definitely a good thing to take. Now, when it comes to usefulness of some of those, not all of them are made the same. Some of them probably not as good quality as others. Maybe doing a little bit of research to find out which source of these probiotics is shown to actually contain good bacteria that are going to survive and thrive versus those that are not prepared in the correct way. So they're not going to really reach the destination as they're supposed to.
Okay, and one other question we have, it says gluten-free diet is now all the rage. I'm sorry. it's purported that gluten constitutes to inflammation. What part does gluten, if any, play in the microbiome?
So gluten is a protein of a plant origin, and by itself is neither positive nor, I mean, it's not dangerous. I think that's part of the reason I don't like these fad diets, because they start with an idea that may be true for some people. I mean, there are some people who are truly gluten sensitive or even have, pronounced allergies, but by and large, that's not true for most of us. And so eating food that contains gluten, it's usually going to be food that also contains lots of fiber. So sometimes it is important to look at the complexity of the meal and say, okay, protein is good. You have to have certain balance in the amount of protein that you're having. So about 20% of your daily intake should be protein. More than 50% should be carbohydrates. 50 to 60% should be carbohydrates, particularly lots of fiber. So saying that gluten is going to induce inflammation, it's true for some people. It's not true for most of us.
Okay, thank you again. I'm going to go to McKinley. McKinley? All right, there you are.
Thank you. First, I will make sure to add to that gratuity jar. Thanks, Simona, for your informative talk. 3 big things jumped out at me that I'd like you to please comment on. The first that I observed is the number of times that energy popped up in your slides. I counted at least 5. And this apparent link between the microbiome and energy production is especially significant in relationship to the mitochondria pathology and senescence. The second thing that jumped out at me is the relationship to stress. And perhaps again, you might want to comment on that. But significantly for me, I saw that although the microbiome's profile can change over one's lifetime, the profile matures by age 3. Now, the reason that's significant to me is that it is about around the same age that about 90% of brain circuits are developed in children, even though, as we've talked about before, brain plasticity allows for continuing development of the brain. But that coincidence of the age is a very important observation. So the important foundational link between these 3 factors seems to be diet. Whether it's the diet of the ancestors, the immediate parents, and so on and so forth. And echoing Peter, it seems to me that our Creator, understanding the critical function of diets to our optimal health, specified the best diet. So can you sort of comment on these 3 observations?
Thank you, McKinley. I knew they were going to say the energy thing.
Yes, you mentioned it 5 times.
Well, it's because the microbiome is extremely important for maintenance of the energy in our body. Actually, there is a theory that mitochondria itself is of bacterial origin. So it's obviously very important, not only because it produces energy, but it also maintains all the processes that are involved in regulation of the energy expenditure. So, for example, there is a very famous study of identical and fraternal twins, and they were looking at their microbiome and their weight. And so what they found that even in identical twins, you have huge differences in weight, can have huge differences in weight, if and they have totally different microbiomes. And so their ability to utilize energy is different based on the type of bacteria that was present in their gut. So this balance, energy balance, is truly directed by our bacteria, not only by our activity and our diet, but really there is this major factor that most people don't even consider. So, for example, if you feed your bacteria really well, and you eat lots of fiber, and I mean lots, let's say 1 gram of fiber, which is a tiny amount, that amount is sufficient to feed your bacteria and maintain your healthy weight. If you reduce that below that, or if you eat food that doesn't contain fiber, you're going to start feeling sick because your bacteria are not healthy. So it's a very, very interesting concept that this energy expenditure at the level of each cell is probably direct, has some connection to bacteria ancestrally speaking, but also that bacteria that live in us direct, how energy is being produced and how it is being utilized. As for maturity by the age of 3 and brain circuit development, that's not a coincidence. Actually, there are quite a few scientists that believe that these two things are connected, and that this diversity of bacteria and their influence on on the brain during the development is one of the key factors that makes the brain develop and myelinate and create all these connections that are necessary for a healthy brain to function. Now, secondly, if you remember, I talked also about the fact that bacteria produce neurotransmitters similar to those that are produced in the brain, that are produced by the enteric nervous system or the brain in our gut. So these 3 systems communicate continuously at the synaptic level, at the level of neuron to neuron interaction, and they're sending important information by doing so, whether it's to inhibit certain pathways or to excite certain pathways. And so this is a dynamic system that continues to function throughout our lifetime. And the part that is really important for all of us, because none of us are under the age of 3, to my knowledge, this diversity of microbiome can be maintained by good diet in healthy to go into healthy aging. That's going to maintain this healthy circuitry in your brain, in your gut, and this multidirectional communication that exists between these systems. And it's true, you mentioned also stress. Stress is a big factor. So there are 2 types of stress. So one is what I call acute stress. There's something that happens right here, right now. And then the other type is the chronic stress. So usually acute stress is a direct response to an environmental stimulus. So something happens and your body reacts, and it sends all these hormones, it floods your bloodstream, and you react to that stressful situation. It is, for example, right now I'm under stress because I've been presenting. So my body is more alert because of that. So there is no great chance I'm going to fall asleep in the middle of the presentation. On the other hand, you may, if I'm boring, because you're not under stress. When you're listening to this, unless there is a problem that you have identified and now suddenly you become worried about things, now you're getting stressed. So this type of stress is very reactive. It's something that happens in a moment. It's something that we react to our environment. It is critical for our survival. However, what happens in our bodies is that there are certain types of stress that become chronic stress. And this kind of stress is also regulated, can be regulated by bacteria. So for example, there are certain molecules that become, we start producing certain molecules in a higher concentration if we have certain types of diet, right? And that kind of, for example, very high protein diet can produce certain type of molecules that can induce anxiety in certain people. And so people who are prone to anxiety may want to reduce maybe the amount of protein they eat or change the type of protein they eating. So all these things, there are microbes, microorganisms involved somewhere in the process. Now, I have also some theories regarding some of the chronic diseases that develop. I think that many of these chronic diseases developed are actually a result of a system that's trying to protect us that's been going on for too long, right? So for example, atherosclerosis, we all know there are plaques that start on our arteries, and that with time these plaques, they start growing, and at some point they can close the artery, and that closes ischemia, can cause heart attack or stroke or embolism in your lungs or many other different things. But if you look at the beginning and you look at the areas where these plaques start, it is always the area of the high pressure. So it is the place where you have either mechanical pressure from blood flow that is kind of hitting the wall because your blood pressure is too high for too long. You're probably being too stressed, too stressed too often, and so your blood pressure goes up. And if you don't find the time to relax and find the time to balance yourself, it can become something that happens more often than it should be. What happens, you start getting this damage inside the blood vessels, and lipoproteins, particularly what people call bad lipoproteins or LDL, low density lipoproteins, their function is actually to be like mortar and to kind of cover the area where there is damage to keep it from being damaged further. However, if you don't solve the problem, high pressure in this case, then this keeps happening and then becomes detrimental, right? And so then, these lipoproteins get inside your artery wall, they start doing all kind of other damage. You have oxidative damage, so all these other things happen as a result of a long-term effect that in the beginning was meant to be good, but because it didn't take care of the cause of the problem, it continues to happen. And so I think the same thing is with microbiome. Microbiome is meant to be good. It is, if we don't take good care of it and we maintain poor diversity of microbiome, we are not having good diet that is maintaining the health of microbiome, then, they start slacking at their job and not doing it as well as they should. And that increases all these other things, including, the elements of stress and all these long-term diseases that we usually associate with age, like cardiovascular disease and dementias and so on and so on. Another interesting thing that I have been thinking for a long time, for example, diabetes. I think that at some point we will find out that diabetes is actually bacterial. By and large, can be directed by bacteria in this interaction between brain and gut. That's a completely different, much larger topic, but there are so many things we still don't know. What we do know is that this microbiome, this system in us, these trillions of commensal bacteria that live in us and other types of microbiota and viruses and so on, that they have a function. And we need to do all we can to maintain this garden of ours, this universe of good bacteria that helps us to remain healthy. I hope I answered at least to some extent your questions.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
thank you very much. Just quickly here, there's a connection to nutritional psychiatry, as Dr. Capino has shared with us in our digital potluck, and perhaps we can talk about this in the next session as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, McKinley.
There is definitely connection. So we know, for example, that people, particularly people with certain kinds of like depression, anxiety, they're very, very sensitive to diet interventions. And actually diet in some people who are resistant to treatment by antidepressants, diet can actually help and restart the system and help them. So there is a very strong link with PTSD, with lots of other psychiatric conditions and diseases. So it is definitely something that should be taken into account. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Simona. I want to go now to Robert Fork. Geo Bob, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Simona. Just to comment on something you said a lot earlier. I worked in Africa for a while with the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. And I remember that they trained us to be very careful about how we interacted with the animals, because they told us exactly what you said, is that the animals were more in danger from us than we were from them. And so I thank you for that comment. Also, you mentioned something about red meat, and the amount of it and so on. I remember working with the nomadic peoples in West Africa. They were meat eaters, but they would only eat meat maybe once or twice a week at the most. And most of the time it was grains and vegetables and other kinds of things. So, your idea about the balance of diet, I think makes a big difference. But the question I wanted to ask, and kind of builds on what you were just discussing, how much of this knowledge that you're getting and others are getting is seeping into the science of diet, of dietitians. If everyone is different in terms of how our microbiome works, how do you get good advice as to how it? Do you just test? I mean, yourself individually? Do you find out, and you say what works for you? How would we know what the best diet for us would be, or how would we go about testing and finding out what the best balance would be? Whether we do it individually or we get it from a dietitian, how do we get that knowledge and get it to work right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. This is a really important thing. I find that dietitians generally kind of lag behind the scientists. So lots of the information that dietitians sometimes give to people is obsolete. Even the information that doctors give to people, I really don't want to hear another doctor telling their patient to drink wine as a way to make themselves healthy. I think that's just preposterous. But much of this information is out there. People kind of know about it. It's just that they don't really pay attention to it because they don't consider food to be therapeutic. And it is. There is no question about it. The food that we eat can both make us sick, and they can also make us healthy. And so finding what works for you is not that simple. But generally speaking, if you have a diet that is very rich, that is diverse, that contains many different kinds of vegetables and fruit and grains and nuts and different sources of oil, for example, olive oil in particular, avocado oil, things like that. You just want to find a good, healthy balance for yourself. Also, sources of like milk, yogurt, kefir, all these other things. So having good balanced diet means having diversity in your food. And so then finding exactly what works the best for you. Now that would be a little bit more difficult because each person again has different composition and number of different species in their gut. And we don't yet have tools that are available to everybody. There are certain clinical trials and studies where people are trying to find certain things. And at some point, I believe probably in the next 15 to 20 years, it will be available probably to everybody, just like you have like Cologuard right now that you can take a stool sample and they can tell you whether you have any signs of cancer in your gastrointestinal tract. Probably something similar will exist at some point to tell you what kind of bacteria you have and what do you need to do to make it better. So it is something that will exist. There are some smaller companies that already start working on it, but it is not really widely available yet.
Oh,
Okay,
thank you very
Simone?
much. Just one quick follow-up. What does this teach us, tell us about people who are lactose intolerant? Is that a purely genetic, or could that be also, because I understood working in Africa that certain African populations have a stronger reaction to lactose than others. Is this a genetic or racial type of thing? Could that also be related to microflora?
Well, it's a combination of both. So yes, some people have genetic predisposition to lactose intolerance. You can even, if you do your genetic testing, you can find that out whether you do or don't. But not everybody reacts the same way, and some people, for example, get truly sick if they eat any kind of meat products, and while others get just maybe a little bit of mild discomfort in the beginning, and then after that they get okay. So yes, it is there is a genetic component, but I believe there is also a combination, what kind of bacteria is present that may be more sensitive to milk and milk products. Generally speaking, I don't like making statements that are generalized and apply on everybody, because again, we are all different. We have different genetics, we have different microbiome. We need to find out what works for us. And some people can eat as the day is long and they're never going to get fat, and some people just look at food and get fat. So we have different metabolism, and much of that also depends on the type of bacteria that we have as well. So there are all
Okay.
kinds of things. Yeah.
Simone, I want to go to one last question here. Thank you so much for that. Bud, I'm going to ask you to have the last question, and then David, we're going to turn that over to you. So Bud, you have the.
Hey, thanks, Forrest. A personal comment to Peter. Peter, I see more of your ceiling than I see of your face. And I prefer to better understand you when I can read your lips. And I do appreciate your comments. And then for Simona, regular times to eat, is that critical? Is that important?
Not as important as we used to be taught. So there are all kinds of ideas about, how much you need to eat and when. There is some research that has been shown. Again, it's just a matter of curiosity for me, so I'm informed. I'm not an expert in this, but that, for example, shortening the time when you are eating during the day may be better for certain people. And again, that may not be true for everybody. Some people have much higher metabolism. If they don't eat regularly, they become hypoglycemic, or their blood sugar drops. They don't feel well. They start feeling faint. Their brain is not working well, so that's not a good idea. People who are using insulin or similar drugs, they also need to be very careful about that. So there are lots of factors that need to be taken into account, but this limited fasting or intermittent fasting seems to work pretty well for certain people even for people who have certain types of diseases. So it is really not that simple. to say for an individual what would be the right thing to do, but you need to kind of experiment and find out what makes you feel the best.
So is there anything to the idea that one needs to give their stomach a rest?
Well, nobody should be eating 24/7. We are not that kind of, I mean, there's certain animals that need to do that, but we don't. We have capability of storing fat, which is basically a way of storing energy, and that fat can be then released and refashioned in almost anything. So it is important to find out, you know, what is good for you. Generally, you don't want to eat nonstop.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. David, I want to turn this over to you and then we'll end it and then we'll go to the foodless potluck.
Thanks, Peter. I can see your lips now. That's going to be very helpful to me, Guy.
Thank you,
Okay.
Simona. This has been very, very rich, and we will schedule you maybe 6 months from now for your next presentation. This has been very, very valuable, and we are most grateful to you. Just a couple of comments before we quit. Thank you to everybody who was able to participate in the potluck last week. I heard very good reports about it. Thank you to Jeff and to Donna for hosting that. I hope we can have another one on February 4, because David, David Trim from the General Conference will be with us that weekend, and it might be fun to get together with him. Secondly, Bob Ford, our own Geo Bob, will be on ABC News not too long from now, because the camera crew has been out on his property, discussing with him how he manages his land and so forth. So on the David Muir program, and perhaps elsewhere, we will see our own, very own Dr. Bob Ford. I hear people say, why don't Adventists get involved? Well, they are involved. And Bob Ford's a good example of that. Next week, and the two after that, we're going to be looking at the issue of theodicy. I know Monty's been very interested in that, and have all the rest of us, but Barry Casey, some years ago, wrote a dissertation on theodicy, and it has 3 main sections to it. And I'm asking him to take one of those sections per week for the next 3 weeks. And I think that will be different and it will be fun. All right. I think that's it for now. Again, thank you, Simona. And here is our benediction, to be followed by the digital foodless potluck. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Thank you, Simona.
Yes, thank you very much, Simona. Okay, I'm going to end the recording right now.